There you go.
Ta-da.
You're not on full screen on your thing yet, so you might want to do that. But we're live already, so there you go.
There we go.
There you go.
Hey, everybody.
We're live.
Welcome to Thursday night. Welcome to our online Bible study. I see so many of you have already joined us from all over, actually. So thank you so much for joining us, Miss Polly and Miss Catherine in Texas.
And Marie,
So,
the
hope you're
Sardinas,
not
and
getting,
Brian.
like,
Brian from Lakewood. Whoa.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian.
Texas, I think you guys are getting pretty serious thunderstorms, if I remember correctly. Hope all is well. So, and Brian's on board, and the Sardinas are back online. So, thank you for joining us. So, welcome everybody. So, tonight we are going to be studying Leviticus chapter 13. Now, from our perspective, this is a pretty cool. You want to do split screen?
Yeah, don't.
That one.
Yep.
Ta-da! From our perspective, chapter 13 is fascinating. But for some of y'all, it might not be so thrilling because it's all about skin disease. So it's all about.
Just think back to your teenage years with all the acne, man. You would have been in isolation a lot.
Acne, boils, pus, leprosy.
Lovely.
Flesh wounds of all sorts. It's a pretty detailed chapter, but we're gonna think why.
So your foot's hitting that.
Why
table.
Why does God care so much about skin disease? But we will see. We will see. There's a purpose for everything that's in the Bible. So fear not. We will endeavor to get through it. It's a lot of verses. It's 50 odd verses.
I got blue dots on my head.
So she got blue dots on her head. So
What's up with that? If you don't want to see the blue dots, you can watch this on YouTube.
There you go. So anyway, so without further ado, we are going to go before the blue dots drive gay crazy. We're going to go.
Heck, I'm like the cat. I'm like.
There we go. Verse 1.
Press the blue dot. Press the blue dot. It's like a laser pointer.
Chapter 13, verse 1.
Okay. It's funny to watch on the delay.
Yeah, it is kind of funny. So.
Robin. Hi, Robin. Oh, hi, Carolyn. Good to see your
back.
typing.
Carolyn's back. Thanks
so
for
good to
joining
see
us.
your typing. Yay. Okay, we're in Leviticus chapter 13. We're going to talk about skin disease. Yay. Okay. Ooey gooey skin disease. Carolyn's back. I know. You were on vacation.
I'm back. Yeah, I hope you had a great time.
Hope you had a great time. Our
Robin's
friends
with your mom. Hi, Mom. So
our Carolyn, I know you went one of your excursions back east. You went to the Ark Encounter and to the Creation Museum.
Oh, yeah.
And our friends, Pastor Paul and Tina Karnick, who actually are lead pastors of this church where we broadcast from, 14:6 Church. They went there finally. They went there on June 13th and June 14th.
Yeah,
so they
so
went to the Ark and to the Creation Museum.
excited to hear what their spin on it is.
Yeah, so awesome. Anyway, that just reminded me of that. I don't know if you went there this time, but I know that you travel back that way sometimes on your vacation. So, okay, Leviticus chapter 13, ooey gooey skin disease. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when someone has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest.
Okay.
So here we go.
Right out the gate, we see that the priests are charged with examining individuals who have these various skin diseases. And you think, my goodness, that's an odd role. But again,
I'm so glad that this part of being a
pastor,
minister or pastor has changed.
Yeah.
Like, you don't need to show me your the scabs and things on your skin.
Yeah, we
but
see
back
enough
in
in our
Moses' day,
yeah.
you did need to show anything like that to the priest.
And throughout the centuries, the priestly class, if you will, if you can use that term, the priestly class were often also the medicinal class. They were trained in the ancient texts and things of that nature, and not always saying they were effective, but they were the most trained in the group.
Right.
So we had a young lady that used to be in our college age Bible study several churches ago, and she was an EMT here, and she went on a missions trip, and the leader of the missions trip gave her a book on dentistry and said, "Here, read this while we're on the plane. You're going to need this when we get off the plane." And then when they got off the plane, she told us later, she said, "You see that line of people over there? They're all here for you to work on their teeth." And she said, "I'm not a dentist." And he goes, "Did you read the book?" She said, "Yes." He goes, "Then you know more than anybody about teeth in this entire location.
You're the expert.
You're the expert. You're the dentist." So, and sometimes that's how the priestly class operated, no pun intended, functioned back in the day.
So Robin said, "What?" right off the bat, what kept the priest from catching it? So I think we're going to go into a little bit explanation about the word that's translated leprosy in our text.
Yes.
But basically, not all of these skin diseases were highly contagious. We're talking the term leprosy is actually kind of a broader term. We're saying leprosy because that's what's written in our text, but the original Hebrew word in this context actually doesn't mean just specific leprosy. And even that, it's contagious, but it's not like super easily transferred. I mean, it's not a virus that's spread by just being in the same. It's not airborne.
Right.
So a little bit more of like personal contact.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit.
So
yeah.
So it wasn't that easy to catch, basically.
And keep in mind that the priests.
But good question.
The priests were charged with constantly washing their hands
Lori
and
Hoyt.
keeping their hands clean. So, above all, they were often the cleanest individuals in that environment.
Right, yeah, the priests had access
Right.
to, also, medicinal oils and things,
Right,
so.
right, and we've talked about this in previous studies how that knowledge was lost, and like in even up into 18th century England, doctors were responsible for spreading disease because they did not wash their hands as they ought to, and there were several literally life-changing experiments showing that keeping themselves clean actually contributed to their longevity as well as that of their patients. So, starting off chapter 13, again, keep in mind that chapter 13 is amongst about half a dozen chapters dealing with purity, being
Right.
set apart and separated from the cultures around the Hebrew peoples. And so that's vitally important for understanding the why and the what of all of these regulations that we're about to dive into. So just as Gay said, the Hebrew priest physicians appear to have been the first in the ancient world to isolate persons suspected of infectious or contagious diseases. And indeed, they were charged with that responsibility by God himself. Verse 3.
The priest shall look at the infected area on the skin of the body, and if the hair in the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is an infection of leprosy. When the priest has looked at him, he shall pronounce him unclean.
And that last word that's the key to understanding all of the stuff that we're going to read. Unclean, impure, not in alignment with how things ought to be. Oh, I just saw Lori. Hi, Lori.
Yep.
Sorry about that. I just noticed you were online. Thanks for joining us. But yeah, so that whole concept of cleanliness, and so this also extends not just beyond hygiene, but also ritual and moral and ethical cleanliness. It's extending beyond that, which will help us to understand. I'm not sure if we'll get there that far this tonight, but some of the other verses that are talking about clothing and even wall coverings, like what does that have to do with leprosy? We shall see. Okay, so the word that is used is I believe it's pronounced sarat. Okay, sarat.
Here.
Okay.
Psalms H 6883. Sara'ath.
Oh, sara'at.
Sara'ath.
That's how this guy says it.
That's how Strong's pronounce it. Sara'at.
You gotta roll the R.
Yeah.
Sara'at. Anyway, now you know what Strong says.
But follow along here. That word that rolls off the tongue
Sara'at.
is variously transcribed into English and frequently translated as leprosy, though it is not Hansen's disease, which is the actual description of what we think of as leprosy. Okay, it is a term used in the Bible to describe various ritually impure, disfigurative conditions of the human skin, of clothing, and of housing. So now all of these regulations are starting to make more sense. So the individual comes in, if they have some kind of a disfigured, a blemish, if you will, and the priest is to examine it, and initially they're declared unclean, which is a good practice, If somebody walks into an ER and they've got this oozing, nasty wound, you have to assume it's contaminated and has the potential to contaminate other things. Okay, this is just good 21st century hygienic medical practices. So, to explain it further, the condition described in leprosy in the Old Testament section of the Bible is not the same as modern leprosy or Hansen's disease. We're going to be using that term a lot. We're going to have several slides digging deeply into this.
You want me to make that bigger?
Okay. Yeah. If you make that
I'll make
bigger.
it bigger so you guys can see it a little more.
Big slide, lots of words.
Yeah.
Okay. Hansen's disease, as it is often called, as its preferred terminology for today is to call
Right, the modern term for
leprosy is Hansen's disease. Partly because of the stigma associated with that. Partly that stigma has arisen because of even things like the Ben-Hur movie and stuff like that. Nonetheless,
Right.
the Hebrew word sarat is a ritualistic term. That's important. Ritualistic term denoting uncleanliness or defilement and covered uncleanness or defilement, and covered a range of conditions that could affect people, clothing, or even a wall. The conditions described, here we go, okay, I hope you're not eating, includes boils, carbuncles, fungus infections complicating a burn, impetigo, favus of the scalp or crustiness of the scalp, scabies, patchy eczema, and phagedenic ulcer or skin-eating ulcer or let's leave it at that. Impetigo or even vitiligo or vitiligo, thank you. Vitiligo on people.
Which is what Michael Jackson had.
Yes.
He had those white patches on his body.
And we
had
know
vitiligo.
many people who have who are
it's just
affected
an area
by vitiligo.
of loss of pigment.
Loss of pigment is all that is, okay? But we're talking 3,000 years ago, okay?
Right.
On walls or clothing, it was more likely to be fungus, mold, dry rot, even lichen or other similar conditions. There is no evidence, this is important, there is no evidence that diseases described as leprosy in the Bible, or in the Old Testament anyway, had any relationship to modern leprosy. Okay, and that's put out by, believe it or not, there's an organization called the Nepal Leprosy Trust, because leprosy is a problem still in the modern world, in third world countries or countries that have poor access to health care. So leprosy does indeed exist. Okay, but
Did you talk about Molly in the slides?
No, not yet. Oh no.
I mean, in the slides?
No, that's for you to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good.
So
yeah, leprosy still exists.
So let me finish
Okay.
this, and then we can.
You're still going? Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
we're
All right,
still
go ahead.
going.
No, you're still going. Go ahead.
All right. So many have thought leprosy to be a disease of the skin. This is important too. It is better classified, however, as a disease of the nervous system because the leprosy bacterium, it's actually a bacterium, and we'll show a picture of it in a minute, attacks the nerves. Leprosy's agent M. leprae is a rod-shaped bacterium related to the tuberculosis bacterium, which tells us right there that it's slow-growing and usually doesn't need extremely high temperatures. Actually, probably thrives
goes better in cooler temperatures.
Okay, it's spread by multiple skin contacts as well as by droplets from the upper respiratory tracts, such as nasal secretions, that are transmitted from person to person. Now you can talk about Molly.
Well, I don't know. You have a lot more slides
I
just
do.
talking about stuff.
I do.
So we should have put a picture of Molly. So I have
should've.
lots of pictures of. So recently, in our veterinary practice, actually just this past maybe 8-9 months,
Yes.
we met an owner and a dog, the dog named Molly. And Molly was a rescue dog that had been brought up from Tijuana, Mexico.
Mhm.
She was a street dog. She's like a Chow Shepherd, actually Akita mix. And the owner came to us as a second opinion. She had taken Molly to, her other regular vet, and she's good friends with one of our clients. So anyway, we're not taking any new patients, but this one kind of snuck in there because she sent me pictures of these lesions on Molly's ears, the dog's ear, triangle-shaped ear flap, and she had these growths, basically kind of, bulbous kind of growths raised, and they were getting larger and getting bigger and affecting more and more of the ear and both ears. And she had been to, again, her regular vet, and they said, well, we need to cut the ear off and send it in for histopath to find out what it is. And she didn't want Molly to lose her ears, so she ended up, she showed me pictures, and I'm like, okay, well, let me see the dog with that kind of a story. I have to see what I can see. And so we saw her, and then she had an appointment for a needle biopsy at the other practice already. So I said, yeah, get the needle biopsy and then share the results with me. And the needle biopsy, so that wasn't performed by myself, but the other vet. And the biopsy report came back leproid lesion. So they didn't say it was straight out leprosy, but basically what they saw in the biopsy was consistent with leprosy, or leprosy, a bacteria causing leprosy, right? So it wasn't cultured or anything, but this was just from the needle biopsy. And so again, one of the options really for leprosy on a very tip of a body like that is, so the vet there, the other vet said, again, well, now we need to cut her ears off for sure because it's leprosy. But there are medications that, antibiotics, specific ones that a person or an animal can be put on. I've never done that before because I've never seen a case of leprosy in any species. But I looked it up and I talked with the owner, and basically we put her dog Molly on a big long course, like 6 to 8 month course of 2 pretty powerful antibiotics and some topical treatment. And that dog, all the leproid lesions went away. Her ears went back to normal, and Molly still has her ears.
Still has ears.
So,
She's still going strong.
so it's pretty cool. It's like, wow, because we're Christians, we're more aware actually of leprosy than most people are in the world, just because of being a Christian and especially then reading and, pastors preaching on the accounts in the New Testament of Jesus healing lepers, right? So that's part of why leprosy is kind of on our radar, and we're a bit more familiar with the term, and that it's contagious, and that it makes people an outcast, that kind of thing. But the good news is the owner never got any leprosy from the dog,
No.
and Molly's leprosy did not continue to spread, and it responded very nicely to antibiotics. And so I just thought, wow, this is such a cool thing to be a Christian and a scientist and a veterinarian. And how many people get to say they've cured a dog? Or I don't think we actually cure. We kind of feel like we send it into remission sort of.
Yeah.
But basically successfully treated a dog, anyone for leprosy. I'm like, that's just cool. So it'll be coming out in a sermon.
Brian asks the question, was skin cancer a recognizable thing back
Yes.
then? Yes, absolutely.
And some of these descriptions as we go through, that's what they're talking about.
Right, and it fits under that umbrella of the Hebrew term that just is, some people say mistranslated or just
Right.
maybe like carelessly translated as leprosy.
Right.
And so a huge variety of ailments were kind of classified as leprosy.
Right.
And
I was going to say in the NLT, so the New Living Translation that I kind of like, it actually, I have that parallel with NASB right here on my Blue Letter Bible app. And it basically, they translate it, instead of saying leprosy, where it says that in NASB and NIV, they actually just say serious skin disease.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it makes it more understandable.
Right.
So they choose to not just use that, translate that term as leprosy each time. They translate it as serious skin disease. So that's kind of cool.
So now from the AIG, which is Answers in Genesis website, it describes leprosy, or what we're calling leprosy, true leprosy, distinguishing it from that broad umbrella of leprosy. True leprosy starts in the skin and peripheral, or fingers, hands, toes, nose, ears, peripheral nervous system, i.e., outside the brain, then spreads to other parts such as hands, face, feet, earlobes. Patients with true leprosy experience disfigurement of the skin and bones, twisting of the limbs, and curling of the fingers to form the characteristic claw hand. Facial changes include thickening of the outer ear and collapsing of the nose. And if you actually look up the symptoms, and I didn't feel that it was appropriate to post pictures, there are thousands of pictures of individuals that have been afflicted with true leprosy, and it just didn't seem appropriate to blast their images up to here on the screen. Needless to say, there are very characteristic disfiguring properties to leprosy, such that it's fairly easily recognizable. The face takes on what they call a lion face. It flattens, it gets very thickened. The cheeks and jowls kind of bulge out, so that they look sort of like the cowardly lion.
In The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, in The Wizard of Oz. Yeah. So, and then of course the body loses sensation. So many lepers, because they have no feeling, they end up abusing and or unintentionally damaging their fingers and cutting off fingers and
Well, they get a cut and then it gets secondarily infected.
they don't know.
And they don't know. So then they
Yeah.
get gangrene, and then the
Yeah.
infection, causes them to lose their digits and their toes,
Right,
fingers and
right.
toes, and spread upwards.
So, and again, leprosy, we probably have beat this horse long enough, but leprosy that's described in the Old Testament included the actual disease, but it also was an umbrella term that covered a huge number of skin diseases. And a little picture of the bacterium there.
That's a tiny picture.
It's a tiny picture.
You
There's
should have made a bigger picture.
I should have. There's slow-growing rods, bacterium.
So this is what they would have seen on the biopsy on Molly's ear.
Yeah, they would have
from
seen these.
something like
These are
that.
stained, but they would have seen these little guys
They stain them.
affecting the limbs. So, if any of you have
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna
are
go back to
familiar,
split
yeah,
screen.
go back to. Split
But he
screen.
circled Molokai in the chain of the
Right.
Hawaiian Islands there. so-
Most Americans are familiar that on the island of Molokai in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, that there was a very famous leper colony, and something like, I think, 9,000 individuals, if I remember correctly, were transported many times against their will, and just dropped off on this particular extremely isolated portion on the island of Molokai. And initially they were kind of left to fend for themselves. The surrounding area was rich in vegetables and the ability to grow crops, and the ocean was right there, and they could fish and gather food from the ocean. And then the environment was such that only during a very brief window, once a year, could ships drop off supplies. But individuals were taken and left there, and many people died from leprosy, actual leprosy. But as with everything, it got misused, and politically motivated individuals could accuse somebody who merely had a blemish of having leprosy, and they could be basically thrust on this island and left to die. So, yeah, it's a very dark and disturbing part of American history, but And the colonies still exist today.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of those dark
Yeah.
and disturbing parts of history.
Yeah. So this is important. About 95% of people are naturally immune to leprosy.
Which is why it wasn't, the priest didn't catch it.
And that's another
Yeah,
part,
yeah.
reason too. And of course, as Gay just described, even in humans, it's fairly easily treated with
Antibiotics.
with a regimen of antibiotics. Okay. Now, because we live in the United States, one of the main carriers of leprosy, Catherine, we're talking to you because you live in Texas, is armadillos.
They're cute, but they can carry leprosy.
They can carry
Actually,
it.
certain species.
Yeah, this is the 9-banded armadillo, which is the only one that lives. There's about
And I think the 9-banded is the one that can carry leprosy.
Yeah, it is.
So it's the one that you have there in Texas. Sorry, Catherine.
Yeah.
So try not to adopt a little armadillo.
Or just don't kiss them. So, but they can carry leprosy.
Or don't let them sneeze in your face.
And people have caught it from armadillos. I did not know this, but during the Depression, armadillos were, for some people, were a major source of protein, and apparently they taste like pork. So,
wow, little armored pork.
Right.
Porkadillos.
And of course, cooking would render the bacterium harmless.
Porkadillos.
We finally made it to verse 4. Okay.
Oh, there you go. Verse 4. Here we are. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the person who has the infection for 7 days.
Okay.
Oh, Carolyn says there's numerous armadillos in Tennessee now.
Oh.
Really? Wow. Interesting.
So.
The
You didn't eat any, did you? I'm just teasing.
Or adopt one as a pet, did you?
Yeah, you didn't bring one back as a pet, did you?
They could be a different species, actually. It's possible.
Yeah.
And there's one called, I think it's called the Egyptian armadillo, I wanted to say, that the Answers in Genesis Ark encounter actually has one at their petting zoo.
And they test it.
Well, it's not the kind that carries
Yeah,
leprosy.
yeah.
It's a different kind. And it is the cutest little thing. Oh my gosh, it's so cute.
So, here we see
I kind of like armadillos.
centuries, perhaps, ahead of Western medicine, what we call traditional Western medicine. We see God putting into place these regulations of isolation. Isolation, to see how to keep the infection from spreading, keeping in mind that there may have been as upwards of 3 million people kind of in rather crowded conditions, rather marginally hygienic conditions. Now, a lot of the regulations that God gives the people magnified their ability to stay clean and disease-free. And of course, the Holy Spirit, God himself, was watching over the encampment. But these practices did indeed keep the Hebrew peoples safe and sound from infections and stuff, such that other cultures noted that the Hebrew people were and it's in the ancient writings, speaking of the resiliency and the remarkable health that the Hebrew peoples exhibited, and in part it was because of these regulations that God, I'll say imposed, but a better term would be gifted them with. Okay, so after 7 days, verse 5.
Then the priest shall look at him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the infection has not changed and the infection has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 more days.
7 more days. So
okay.
So this is.
But yeah, this practice of isolation, this is really interesting because one of the people I listen to commentary teachers in preparation is, I've mentioned it before, Damian Kyle. He's at Calvary Chapel Modesto, and his recording on YouTube of this chapter of his teaching is from 6 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So it's just really interesting because he spends a couple of minutes talking about this idea that how isolation, how in society at that time, pre-COVID, okay? So 6 years ago, so it's 3 years before COVID. So he spends a few minutes talking about how, that society at the time doesn't really like to sacrifice the good of the one for they don't want to isolate one person, they elevate the goods of the one person as opposed over the goods of many, over the benefit of many, right? And that practice actually just leaves us open to the possibility of some kind of terrible plague coming and spreading and taking over the whole world. And he's talking about this, and I was just
Wow.
like, okay, you know what happened 3 years later, dude?
Wow.
But it's true though. If so the COVID thing, it was very, very contagious, so very hard to isolate everyone. But this practice, if it were followed, if there was one or two or a dozen people that had this new virus and they were isolated, it would have had the result of preventing the spread.
Yeah.
I mean, it would have. So that's why this is really interesting. So Damien Kyle, just put in on YouTube, just search for Damien Kyle, Leviticus chapter 13, and about, I don't know, only 10 minutes into his message, he talks about this whole thing about how that would just be, he talks about the Ebola virus, but because there was no coronavirus or COVID virus at the time, but I was just like, dude, it's kind of prophetic what he was talking about there. He had no idea at the time, but how God's what he's telling his people to do is something that really can protect them, and does end up protecting them as a people from, a lot of diseases that surrounding societies, people groups aren't following this type of thing, so they would not be protected.
Right. Oh, Karen joined us. Hi, Karen. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, hey, Karen. I
Verse
just saw your name over there.
Verse 6. So isolation for 7 days. If no change, 7 more days. So then on the 14th day, essentially.
So then after, 2 periods of 7 days of isolation, the priest shall take another look at him, then look at him again on the 7th day. It's the seventh day. And if the infected area has faded and the infection has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It's only a rash. Hallelujah. And he shall wash his clothes and be clean.
There you go.
So, it's really interesting, this whole thing about isolation and, from a medical perspective, a biological perspective, how important that is. It happens with lots of other diseases and viruses. If your dog gets kennel cough, a bronchitis, you're told to keep your dog at home for how long? About 7 days. And if he's no longer coughing, you can let him go out. And if he's still coughing, you keep him home for what? Another 7 days.
Right.
So it's very interesting.
And again, like we said at the get-go, at the beginning of this study tonight, that the word clean denotes not just hygiene, but also ritually clean. In other words, the person can enter back into society and be a participatory member of society again.
Right.
So pronouncing him clean, not only is his body healed, but he's also healed and brought back into the fold, so to speak. Verse 7.
Verse 7, but if the rash spreads farther on the skin after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again to the priest, and the priest shall look, and if the rash has spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. Again, that word actually means serious skin disease.
Serious skin disease, something that needs to be addressed through isolation and other treatments. And the commentator Morgan says the law provided that there should be a most careful distinction between actual leprosy and that which may appear to be leprosy. When the case was clearly defined one, the method was drastic in the extreme. The person would be isolated and would have to, their entire life would essentially collapse. So that's why such meticulous detail was paid to put a potentially catastrophic disease and just road rash or something of that. So Karen says they weren't allowed inside the city gates until they were cleared. Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there, Karen. They could not be near their family So a lonely time, they would have actually had difficulty getting food. Absolutely, absolutely.
Which is why they started later on, like leper colonies and things, which we mentioned that the island of Molokai, Karen goes to Hawaii from time to time, that the island of Molokai actually was historically a leper colony for many years.
A portion
of it, right.
A segment of it, yeah. So verse 9.
When the infection of leprosy is on someone, then he shall be brought to the priest. The priest shall then look, and if there is a white swelling on the skin, and it has turned the hair white, and there is new raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic leprosy. And again, the Hebrew word leprosy actually just kind of means serious skin disease. It doesn't just mean Hansen's disease. It's a chronic skin disease, serious skin disease on the skin of his body. And the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He shall not isolate him, for he is unclean.
Okay, so in this case, the priest has determined it is not likely to be the deadly form of
contagious
disease, contagious Hansen's disease. It may, in fact, be, as Brian had asked about earlier, a skin cancer or something like that. So he's unclean and unable to participate in some of the ritualistic activities of the community, but he's not isolated.
But he doesn't have to be quarantined.
He's not isolated.
Right.
Robin asked, did they have chicken pox, measles, shingles? Oh yeah, it was a fallen world then. It's a fallen world now.
Right.
So yeah.
I mean, some viruses are things that viruses do sort of like show up, like they mutate, and then so they start causing disease at different points in history, I guess.
Right.
But so do they have exactly all those viruses? I don't know, but they had things like that.
Well, that's actually a good point, because in some of the research that we were doing for this chapter, I was reading that some commentators and medical epidemiologists, people who that's their livelihood is to study diseases and the spread thereof, felt like true leprosy actually was primarily endemic in the region of India and eastern Mesopotamia, if you will, and that it wasn't until Alexander the Great in his conquest brought it back with his troops and spread it all throughout the Middle East.
Soldiers.
So what's referred to as leprosy in the Old Testament included a whole plethora of skin diseases, but by the time of Jesus, leprosy was much more prevalent.
Yeah, the actual Hansen's disease leprosy
was actually
right. The specific disease
was actually much more prevalent in the Middle East than it was at the time of immediately following Moses and such. So chronic skin disease, serious skin disease, you're unclean, but you're not isolated.
Right. So that could be like it's some kind of skin cancer or something.
Right.
So the priest is determined by what God is giving them, the guidelines, that it's a serious skin disease, but it's not the type that's going to be spread to other people.
Right.
And they're literally just knowing this only because of what God's telling them. So it's really cool. So verse 12, if the leprosy breaks out farther on the skin and the leprosy covers all the skin of the person who has the infection from his head even to his feet, as far as the priest can see, then the priest shall look, and behold, if the leprosy has covered his entire body, he shall pronounce the one who has the infection clean. It has all turned white, and he is clean.
Okay. In other words, the infection has spread. It's run its course. It left scarring, or disfigurement, but it's no longer contagious. It's no longer contagious, and that's the operative word. It's the white scarring of the body is indicative of the infectious process having passed. And so now he's pronounced clean. That individual can once again return to society and participate in the communal rituals and things of that nature. Verse 14.
But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. The priest shall look at the raw flesh, and he shall pronounce him unclean. The raw flesh is unclean. It is leprosy.
Again, and the rawness there is indicative of an active
Right.
process going on.
The NLT says if any open sores appear, that's
Yeah.
what the term raw flesh is really reflecting, open sores. So if any open sores appear, the infected person will be pronounced ceremonially unclean. The priest must make this pronouncement as soon as he sees an open sore, since open sores indicate the presence of skin disease. I like how they
Active
put it. It makes
infection.
it more clear.
Yeah, active infection would be a good way of putting
Right.
it. And it is leprosy, serious skin disease. Now here's a fantastic place to pause, because why so much emphasis on quote unquote leprosy, zarat, as the Hebrew peoples called it. Okay, well, leprosy is actually a good analogy. Serious skin disease is actually a good analogy for sin. Okay, and many ancient rabbis considered a leper, someone with a serious skin disease, as someone already dead. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Leprosy is like skin.
Like
catch
sin.
this, like sin. Sorry.
He said skin.
It is skin, like sin.
Leprosy affects the skin.
Affects it. This is heavy. This is really worth paying attention to, because this took me aback a little bit when I first read it. Okay, leprosy is like sin in that it begins as nothing. Okay, a little blister, a little tiny thing, a little slight
blemish,
imperfection,
Right.
blemish upon the skin, and that's how sin is. Oh, just a little deviance from godly behavior, a little minor infraction of against God's commandments, and so on. So it's painless in the first stages. It's painless. You might not even know that you're infected. Okay, you might not be aware that you have anything. Many of you know that my mom is currently bedridden. She broke her leg, so she's currently bedridden. We just found out she has, they said it's not a bed sore, but she was not aware that she had a little wound. Okay.
On her hip, on the part where her body's resting in the bed. So I called it a bed sore.
Yeah, the nurses were like, "Oh, that's not really a pressure point."
It's not a pressure point. Well,
yeah, it kind of is.
You've been laying in bed for 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
So, but my mom wasn't aware of it. But trust me, Gay is checking my mom quite rigorously, and she noticed it, because if we don't get on it, it could spread. It could become something incredibly serious. And sin is like that. It's painless in its first stages. Now, when a bed sore gets so bad that it's causing the individual pain, it's serious. But it's not painful right now. So we're living this out as we talk about it. Not that my mom's in sin, but just that she's ill.
Right.
Okay. It grows slowly. It grows slowly. True leprosy, like we mentioned earlier, it's in the tuberculin family, and it grows slowly. It could be weeks or months before actually any appreciable damage is affected upon the individual. And the same sin is the same way. We frequently in Christian circles talk about the hardening of the heart. Okay, the hardening of the conscience. Okay, the dulling of the senses of watching out for what could harm us. It's the same way. Most true lepers, they're unaware that they're losing finger sensation. If you have anybody in your family who's a diabetic, you know how careful you have to be and inspect their feet. If you're diabetic, you know how important your doctor is, or how much your doctor harps on you to check your toes, check your feet, look for any little thing. I've done that. I've looked at my dad's feet and I've seen a little wound, and I'm like, I am on the phone like right away. You've got to get my dad in. He has a wound on his toe. And they're like, yep, bring him in tomorrow. So, so sin grows slowly. It's often painless. Leprosy often remits for a while and then returns. Okay.
It goes into remission.
Goes into remission. Brian mentioned that. Oftentimes, a cancer is notorious for doing that. It'll go into remission and then come back. It'll come back. And so I was just talking to my sister, ironically, earlier this afternoon, and she had gone into her oncologist because she has had in the past, she has had thyroid cancer, and something came up on a recent scan, and so she had to go in and have some tests done. And she just talked to her oncologist today, and the oncologist said, I'm happy to report that you are in what looks like 100% remission, not cure, but remission right now. So so she was quite elated. But yeah. But sin is like that. Sometimes it looks like you can get a handle on it, and then wham, when you least expect it, Satan starts whispering in your ear and brings you down right back into that thing that you thought you had mastery of. It numbs the senses. It numbs the senses. One cannot feel in the afflicted area. Talking about that with diabetics, with lepers, okay? But also with somebody whose senses are so dulled to sin that they don't see it. They don't see it. And ultimately, it causes decay and deformity. And we can see how that happens. Robin asks, did the rubbing of the leper's clothing spread it to other parts of the body? Good question. I don't really know the answer.
I don't think so. I mean, because leprosy, I mean, it could, I guess, with other types of skin disease, if we're talking about the general term leprosy, but the specific disease leprosy, like we said before, it likes that bacteria likes to grow at cooler temperatures, so it would, and it's actually surrounding the nerve sheath.
Yeah.
So it actually is a disease more of the nerves, but because it affects the nerves, the skin, the digits, and it lives in the distal or peripheral, at fingertips and toes and ears, like Molly the dog. That's where it grows the best, and then it affects the nerve endings, and then it can cause, bulbous growths, but it can also just be, it dulls the senses, the sensation in those areas, and so then there become injuries and secondary wounds and secondary infections. So,
Yeah.
So traditional leprosy, I would say no, that the clothing rubbing wouldn't cause any issues or make it worse or help it spread. But other kinds of disease, I suppose. I mean, and when we get to the part about the clothing, which might be why you're asking that, if you've read
Yeah.
ahead, which I hope you have, you probably have, that they talk about cleaning the clothing. It's just that it could be
Absolutely.
contaminated with the bacteria, not that the clothing on the body was causing the disease to
Right,
be
right.
spreading. It's just that the clothing very likely could have bacteria in it, and
Right.
therefore it could cause it to spread. I hope that answers your question.
This is a
Good
powerful
question.
quote by Spurgeon, talking about that whole concept of leprosy being uncleanness and contamination and such. And Spurgeon, he is renowned for not pulling any punches, and he doesn't pull them here either. Every man, every person, by nature, is like a leper, loathsome in his person, infected in all his actions, and in all that he does. He is incapable of fellowship with God's people, and he is shut out utterly and entirely by his sin from the presence and acceptance of God. Okay? So we know, as Karen had pointed out, that, and we'll talk about it here either today or next week, but talks about true lepers being outcasts from society, and they were feared and hated unjustly, but nonetheless they were hated, and the disease would continue to spread through their bodies without the benefit of antibiotics. It would spread slowly, but relentlessly through their body, and would affect all that they do. Because remember, it twists the bones, it affects the nerves. Ultimately, it's going to make it difficult for them to walk, to handle things, to do the things that we take for granted, and it would make them incapable of participating in the community. And sin does the same thing. It makes us incapable of having proper fellowship with God's community. Okay, and sin gets a hold of us, and it shuts us out entirely from the presence and acceptance of God. What keeps us away from fellowship with God? Sin. What taints our thinking so that we think we can't associate with God's people? Sin. And in that regard, sin is very, very much like leprosy, and it's such a important lesson for us to walk away with tonight. So verse 16.
Or, if the raw flesh turns back and is changed to white, then he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall look at him, and behold, if the infected area has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce the one who has the infection clean. He is clean. So, again, it's really cool that God isn't like, oh, you have a lesion, you're out, you're imperfect, kind of like Hitler was like, oh, all these people are deemed imperfect. So
Right.
God's like, oh no, God knows, of course, what it is, what's causing the issue, but he is giving them really great guidelines to be like, okay, well, you just go isolate for a few days and come back, or you don't have to isolate, but if that changes, you need to come see me again, and then, we'll pronounce you clean, now that you're no longer having a active infection, an open sore, so very good.
I love these two verses. I just love these two verses. You think, wow, what a weird couple of verses to love. This is us. This is Jesus.
Right.
This is Jesus. We come to Jesus, we're raw, infected, filled with pus. But if we hang on and we do the right thing, which is turn to Jesus, then it says, the Bible literally says, we're washed as and made clean, like new fallen snow. And then the infected area becomes white. We are scarred. We may be scarred. We carry those scars from our past life, from our infected life. It may follow us throughout our days here on this planet. But we're made clean.
That's right.
We're clean. I love this. This is Jesus. This is Jesus. This is what he does for us.
Right. So, got to realize that disease is often an analogy for sin in Scripture. So, reading this passage and seeing how it points, like Dan was just saying, points to Jesus and what he's done for us. So the sin is something, that we all are sinful as we're born, humans, sinful nature. And then, sin is something that is washed clean. So it's interesting that in this chapter, this all about skin disease, the analogy of sin, it really holds true. How sin is we're not cured from sin. We are washed clean of our sin by the blood of Jesus.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens here. The leprosy, the skin disease can be deemed clean, and then you'll see a little bit later where they literally wash their clothing and they wash themselves and they're washed clean, and then they're considered clean again. And like Dan was saying, so that's what happens with sin in our lives, and Jesus' blood washes us clean. We're not cured of sin until we're in heaven.
Right.
And leprosy, also the actual Hansen's disease leprosy, is something that we can be treated and can be put into a dormant state, but it's not actually cured this side of heaven.
Right.
So very interesting.
I do remember when I was in high school, a street evangelist came to school, to our high school one day. Probably something that would never ever happen now. Nonetheless, this street evangelist came and this is back in the 70s, and this boy was all tatted up, and he had scars all over his body from knife wounds, and I think he was missing part of a finger that had gotten cut off in a knife fight. He was a mess, right? But he was a believer in Jesus Christ, and he proudly got up there and he said, "These scars I will carry these scars with me for the rest of my life. But I know that these scars don't define who I am, because I have been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb."
Amen.
That is amazing.
Yeah, amen.
We can skip that one. Go to verse 18. Oops, typo.
Now, when the body has a boil on its skin and it is healed, and the place of the boil, and in the place of the boil there is a white swelling or a reddish white bright spot, then it shall be shown to the priest.
Okay, boils would have been very common in a desert, dusty environment, in a hot environment with woolen clothing. Yeah, the lost the picture and audio. Oh, sorry about that. Looks like we're still going. We're still going on the other resources. So, oh, Brian says he lost it too. So, sorry about that. We didn't touch nothing.
I didn't touch nothing. Well, hopefully it'll still be recording. You can watch it on YouTube.
So,
sorry, guys.
Looks like we're still moving. We're still moving on Exclaim. So,
And on YouTube.
yeah, hopefully it'll be restored shortly. But we're going to keep going because we're almost at our stopping point here. So, the body has a boil on it, which would have been very, very common. Okay. And in place of the boil, there's a healing process is occurring. Verse 20.
And the priest shall look, and behold, if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the infection of leprosy. It has broken out in the boil.
Okay, so the boil itself, which is an infection already, we know that now in modern terms. But if it doesn't appear to be healing, then the priest's duty is to proclaim it or announce it as unclean and go through the isolation process. Verse 21.
But if the priest looks at it, and behold, there are no white hairs in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, and is faded, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 days, and if it spreads farther on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infection.
An infection. He's unclean. He can't participate in things, but he is not. He is not
Still going there too.
considered
Just looking.
a leper at that point. We'll read this verse and then we'll probably stop.
But
here.
if the bright, verse 23, but if the bright spot remains in its place and does not spread, it is only the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean.
Okay, so I think we are going to stop here. But so meticulous care was taken in not just wantonly announcing that people were, oh, you're a leper, you're out, you're gone, you're isolated, but to make sure that that pronouncement was made meticulously and so as to not falsely place the stigma of leprosy and its associated isolation and such on the population. And so I think we will end here because we're only about halfway through this chapter, but this is a good spot to stop. But I hope we can all just truly just dwell on that idea of sin just being the cancerous, leprous contamination, and truly just giving praise and thanks to Jesus for cleansing us and washing us and making us restored again. Though we will carry the skins, the scars of our previous foolishness throughout this life, but we will be restored to redeemed bodies when that day we reach heaven. So we will end there, and we thank you one and all. You guys had great comments tonight. We're so glad that...
We're back now, so we appreciate you guys being here. And do click on that link to our YouTube channel, and if you would subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. What that does is it'll help us be able to control a little bit more about people getting notifications and things like that. So if we get a few more subscribers on YouTube, we can just sort of do a little bit more with it. And you'll get notified if you click on that when we're going live
and
there.
You can click on the blue dots, like right
Those
here
blue
above
dots,
Gay's
right
head.
here.
There should be some blue dots. Yeah, you can click on those, and that'll also allow you for help you to find notifications and such.
Well, that's for the live.exclaim.org.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So if they're already subscribed to that.
Yeah.
They already get that.
Oh, okay.
Most of them already subscribed to that. But you can find the previous lessons on the live.exclaim.org as well. You just have to go over to the menu, and then it says previous studies or something.
with that-
But if you watch YouTube, then all of them are there as well. So,
And with that,
all right, guys,
we bid you adieu. Have a wonderful, blessed, and just phenomenal week.
have a beautiful evening.
Good night, all.
Bye.